When I left the orphanage, they said I had nothing, only the deed to a rusted Quonset I'd never seen. What I found there wasn't just a building. It was the key to a past I never knew I had, and a future I had to fight for. If you've ever felt like you were starting from scratch with the whole world against you, then this story is for you. Stick around, maybe even hit that subscribe button, because we're building a place here for people who know what it feels like to have to build their own foundation. The day I turned 18, the world didn't celebrate. There was no cake, no party, just a cardboard box containing 2 pairs of worn jeans, a handful of shirts, my toothbrush, and a thin manila envelope. The box was my entire life, neatly packaged for disposal. The manila envelope was my future, or so they said. I stood in the gray hallway of the Northgate State Home for Children, the place I'd called home since I was 4, and waited. The air smelled the same as it always did. Institutional bleach, floor wax, and the faint, sad scent of overcooked vegetables. For 14 years, that smell was the first thing I noticed in the morning, and the last thing I tasted before sleep. Now, I was smelling it for the last time, and I felt absolutely nothing. Ms. Albright, my caseworker for the final 2 years, stood by the heavy steel door, her keys jingling impatiently. She was a woman built of straight lines and sharp angles, from her haircut to her pantsuits. Her job was to process children into adults, and she did it with the detached efficiency of a factory foreman. "Leo," she said, her voice flat, "it's time." I picked up my box. It was lighter than I expected. I walked towards her, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. Usually this hall was a riot of noise, kids yelling, social workers calling out names, the distant clang of the kitchen. But they'd arranged my departure for mid-morning, when everyone was in class or group sessions. They didn't like goodbyes. They called them unproductive transitions. Ms. Albright held out the envelope. "This is it," she said, as if handing me a Nobel Prize. "Everything we have for you." I took it. It felt flimsy. "Inside you'll find your birth certificate, your social security card, your final severance stipend from the state, that's $412, and this." She tapped a thicker document through the paper. The deed. The deed to a rusted Quonset hut. That's what she'd told me about last week in our final transitional planning meeting. A piece of property in my name, out in the middle of nowhere, left by a grandfather I couldn't remember. Her tone had been dismissive, almost pitying. She'd shown me a blurry satellite image on her computer screen. It looked like a single metallic scar on a vast, empty patch of brown and white. "There's an offer on the table," she had reminded me then, and she reminded me again now. $3,000 from Northwood Developments. They're consolidating land in the area. Given the state of the structure and the tax liability, it's a generous offer. My advice is to take it. Sign the papers, take the check, and get a real start. An apartment, a proper job. I hadn't answered her then, and I didn't answer her now. The idea of taking the money was sensible. It was the Ms. Albright way. But something in me, a stubborn, quiet thing that had survived 14 years of institutional logic, resisted. It was mine. That one thought was a tiny, hard kernel in the vast emptiness of my future. It was the only thing that was mine. "The bus ticket is for 1 p.m., she said, pulling open the heavy door. A blast of cold November air hit me. It was a different kind of cold than the sterile chill of the home. It was alive. It smelled of wet pavement and exhaust fumes. "Good luck, Leo." She didn't offer a hand to shake. We'd never touched. I stepped out, and the door clicked shut behind me. The sound was so final, so absolute. I stood on the concrete steps for a full minute, the box growing heavy in my arms, the envelope clutched in my hand. I was free. I was terrified. I was 18 years old, and I had a box, $400, and a rusted metal building I'd never seen. It wasn't much of a kingdom, but it was a start. The bus station was a vortex of noise and desperation. People hurried past, their faces tight with worry or exhaustion. I found a hard plastic chair in a corner, put my box between my feet, and held on to it like an anchor. For the first time, there was no one to tell me where to go, what to eat, when to sleep. The silence in my head was louder than the chaos of the station. I opened the envelope. It was all there, just as she'd said. The documents felt alien in my hands. Birth certificate. Leo Mark. No father listed. Mother deceased. Grandfather, Thomas Mark, also deceased. The severance check was crisp, and then the deed. It was on thick, creamy paper, covered in dense legal text. But I saw the important parts, my name and the description of the property. Lot 47, Basin County, Wyoming. And attached to it with a paperclip was a folded, hand-drawn map on yellowed graph paper. A single red X marked a spot off a road I'd never heard of. I stared at the map, then at the bus schedule on the wall. There was a bus leaving for Cheyenne at 1 o'clock. From there, I could find a local line that would get me close. It was a stupid, impractical plan. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to walk to the nearest bank, sign the papers for Northwood Developments, cash the check, and disappear into the city. Find a room, find a job, be anonymous. But the thought of it felt like giving up on the only mystery I'd ever been handed. For my entire life, my story had been written by others, in files and reports I was never allowed to see. This deed, this map, it felt like the first page of a story that I might get to write myself. I folded the map, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I would go west. I would go see my kingdom of rust. The bus ride was a 3-day journey through the slow erosion of civilization. The cities bled into suburbs, the suburbs into sprawling farmland, and finally, the farmland gave way to the vast, humbling emptiness of the high plains. I spent the hours staring out the window, watching America scroll by like a melancholy film. The other passengers were ghosts, each lost in their own world. I kept to myself, nursing a lukewarm coffee from a station vending machine, eating stale sandwiches I bought with my precious stipend. At night, I'd lean my head against the vibrating glass and try to sleep, but my mind was a racetrack. I thought about Ms. Albright's sensible advice. $3,000. It sounded like a fortune. It was the difference between sleeping on a bus and sleeping in a bed. The difference between a hot meal and the gnawing hunger in my gut. Why hadn't I taken it? The question echoed with the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt. Why? 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 Each time the same answer surfaced, quiet and stubborn. Because it was mine. In the orphanage, nothing was ever truly yours. Your bed, your clothes, even your thoughts were subject to inspection and confiscation. The concept of ownership was abstract. But this deed, this land, this was a legal fact. It was a tether, however frayed, to a world outside the institution, to a family I barely knew. I remembered my grandfather only in flashes, like scenes from a movie I'd seen as a small child. A rough, calloused hand holding mine, the smell of sawdust and pine, a deep, quiet voice that rumbled like a distant engine. He died when I was 4, the same year my mother died. The state had decided he was too old, too poor, too unstable to care for me. So I was sent to Northgate, and he became a ghost, a name on a piece of paper. What kind of man leaves his 4-year-old grandson a dilapidated hut in the middle of nowhere? Was it a joke? A final, desperate act? Or was it something else? The bus smelled of diesel and recycled air. I pulled the envelope from my pocket again, tracing the lines of the hand-drawn map. The lines were firm, confident. The handwriting, where it labeled the county road and a nearby creek, was neat, precise. It wasn't the scrawl of a madman, it was the work of someone who paid attention to details. Beside the map, I looked at the letter from Northwood Developments. It was on glossy, expensive paper. The logo was a stylized pine tree over a mountain peak. The language was corporate, friendly but firm. Fair market value, community revitalization, streamlined acquisition process. It felt predatory. They were a shark, and I was a single drop of blood in the water. Ms. Albright had seen it as a lifeline. Sitting on that bus, 1,000 miles from everything I'd ever known, it felt more like an ultimatum. Sign or be devoured. The bus groaned to a halt in Cheyenne, spitting me out into a morning that was colder than anything I'd ever experienced. The wind had teeth. It bit at my face and tore through my thin jacket. The city was bigger than I expected, a strange mix of modern office buildings and Old West storefronts. According to the map, I still had another 100 miles to go, into the heart of Basin County. The next bus, a rickety local liner that serviced the rural towns, wasn't leaving for another 6 hours. I spent the time walking, just to stay warm. I walked past bars with swinging doors, past shops selling cowboy hats and expensive boots, past people who looked like they were carved from the landscape itself. They were weathered, sturdy, and belonged here. I had never felt more out of place. The $412 felt smaller with every hour that passed. I bought a thicker coat at a second-hand store, a wool-lined monstrosity that smelled of mothballs and someone else's life. It cost me $60, a painful but necessary expense. The remaining money I guarded like a dragon, counting it in my head over and over. Finally, it was time. The local bus was nearly empty. There was me, an old woman with a face like a wrinkled apple, and a young man in a dusty work shirt who smelled faintly of livestock. The driver, a large man with a magnificent gray beard, grunted as I handed him my ticket. "Where are you headed, son?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Grover Creek," I said, naming the closest landmark on my grandfather's map. He raised an eyebrow. "Ain't much out at Grover Creek, 'cept Grover Creek. And wind." "I have a place out there," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He just nodded, as if he'd heard it all before. The bus lurched away from the curb and into the fading light. The further we went, the more the world dissolved. The roads narrowed. The houses grew farther and farther apart, until there were no houses at all, just endless fences marking off seas of sagebrush. The sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, and then the stars came out. I had never seen so many stars. In the city, the sky was a dull, orange-gray blanket. Here, it was a spill of diamonds on black velvet. It was terrifyingly beautiful. An hour later, the driver slowed. "This is about as close as I get," he said, pointing out the window into the pitch black. "County Road 12. Grover Creek is another 2 miles down that road. Your place on that road?" "I think so," I said, my heart starting to pound. "All right, then." He pulled over, the bus hissing as the door opened. "Watch for rattlers, and the wind'll take the skin right off you if you're not careful." I stepped off the bus and into the abyss. The door hissed shut behind me, and with a roar of its engine, the bus disappeared down the highway, its red taillights shrinking until they were just two more stars in the darkness. And then they were gone. I was alone. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the wind, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from the beginning of time. It was so cold I could feel it in my teeth. I pulled the second-hand coat tighter and slung my box over my shoulder. Using the weak beam of the tiny keychain flashlight Ms. Albright had insisted I take, I found the sign for County Road 12. It was leaning over, half buried in a snowdrift. I started walking. Every step was an act of faith. The road was unpaved, a ribbon of frozen dirt and gravel. The box was awkward, bumping against my leg. My lungs burned with the cold, thin air. After what felt like an eternity, my flashlight beam caught something. A shape, low and long and dark against the horizon. A metallic glint. The Quonset hut. It was bigger than I'd pictured and somehow more desolate. It looked like the bleached carcass of some great metal whale, washed ashore in this ocean of dirt and left to die. Its corrugated steel skin was mottled with rust, great weeping orange streaks against the gray. A section of the roof sagged ominously. One of the large sliding doors was slightly ajar, a black, gaping mouth. There was no sign of life, no light, no smoke from a chimney. Just the relentless wind whistling through the gaps in the metal. This was it. My inheritance. My kingdom. I stood there shivering, my hope draining away into the frozen ground. Ms. Albright's voice echoed in my head. A generous offer. $3,000. I could have been in a warm room right now. I could have been anywhere but here. For a moment, I considered turning back, trying to flag down a car on the highway. But there were no cars. There was nothing. Just me and the rusted ghost of my grandfather's legacy. Taking a deep breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, I walked towards the open door. The inside of the Quonset was a cathedral of cold. It was vast, dark, and smelled of dust, rust, and the faint, sharp tang of mouse droppings. The wind moaned through the curved roof high above, making the whole structure groan like a dying beast. My small flashlight beam was swallowed by the darkness, only illuminating small patches of the concrete floor, littered with debris and dirt. I slid my box onto the ground and walked deeper inside, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the cavernous space. Light filtered in through a few grimy, cracked windows high up on the walls, just enough to reveal the scale of the place. It was one enormous room, maybe 100 feet long. At the far end, there was a section partitioned off with rough wooden walls, a small living area, I guessed. The rest of the space was empty, save for a few piles of rotting lumber, a rusty oil drum, and the skeletal frame of an old truck, its tires long gone, its engine block exposed like a dissected organ. This wasn't a home, it was a tomb. A wave of despair, cold and heavy, washed over me. This was a mistake, a stupid, childish fantasy. I had traded a guaranteed $3,000 for this shell. I was an idiot. My grand plan had been to what? Live here? How? There was no power, no water that I could see, no heat. Winter was coming on fast. I would freeze to death in a week. I kicked at a loose piece of metal on the floor, the clang echoing in the silence. Anger flared in my chest, hot and useless. Anger at my grandfather for leaving me this joke of an inheritance. Anger at Ms. Albright for being right. But most of all, anger at myself for being foolish enough to hope. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here and freeze. My first priority was to get a fire going. The rotting lumber could work, if it wasn't too damp. My second priority was to find a water source. The map had shown a creek nearby. My third, and most pressing, was to close the damn door. It took all my strength to budge the huge corrugated door. It screeched in protest on its rusty track, the sound setting my teeth on edge. Finally, with a final groaning shudder, it closed, plunging the interior into near-total darkness. The wind was muffled now, a distant howl. It was colder, but it was quieter. Safer somehow. I used my light to explore the partitioned area. It was a single small room with a cot, a small wood-burning stove, a table, and a single chair. A layer of dust covered everything. On the cot was a thin, moldy mattress and a pile of what looked like old blankets. It was bleak, but it was a space made for a human. It was a start. I spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of activity, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I gathered wood, tested the flue on the stove, and found a small, hand-pump well outside, miraculously unfrozen. The water came out rusty at first, then cleared. It tasted of iron and earth, but it was water. By nightfall, I had a small, sputtering fire going in the stove. It didn't warm the whole Quonset, not even close, but it pushed back the immediate chill in the small room. I huddled next to it, wrapped in the musty blankets from the cot, eating the last of my stale bus station sandwiches. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time in what felt like days, I allowed myself to stop moving, to think, what was I going to do? I could try to survive here. It would be hard, brutal work. Or I could walk back to the highway, stick out my thumb, and leave this place behind forever. I could still call the lawyer for Northwood Developments. The offer was probably still good. They wanted this land, for whatever reason. As I sat there, staring into the flames, my eyes drifted around the small room. It was crude, but it was built with care. The joints on the table were tight. The chair, though simple, was sturdy. This wasn't the work of a man who did things carelessly. My grandfather had built this. Why? I started to clean, more out of a need to keep moving than any real hope of making the place clean. I swept the floor of the small room, raising clouds of dust that shimmered in the firelight. The floor was made of thick wooden planks, different from the concrete in the main part of the hut. As I swept near the wall under the cot, the broom handle snagged on something. A loose board. My heart gave a little jump. It was a classic trope from old movies, but here, in the cold reality of my situation, it felt like a genuine possibility. I got on my hands and knees, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. One of the planks was shorter than the others, and it wiggled when I pushed on it. My fingers were numb with cold, but I managed to pry it up. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space, and in that space was a box. It was an old military ammunition can, heavy and green, with a latch on the side. It was cold to the touch. I lifted it out. It was heavy, so heavy it made my arms ache. I set it on the table, the metal clanking loudly in the quiet room. My breath hitched. This was it. This was something. This was either the punchline to the cruel joke or the first real clue I'd ever had. With trembling fingers, I worked the latch. It was stiff with age and rust. I had to use the handle of my broom to pry it open. It popped with a loud metallic groan. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a stack of yellowed envelopes, tied together with a piece of twine. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were thick, dense bundles of paper. I unwrapped one. It was money. A stack of $100 bills, crisp and clean. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I counted the bundles. There were 10 of them. I didn't dare count the bills in each stack, but it was more money than I had ever seen, more than I could have imagined. My hands were shaking so hard I had to put the bundle down. My head was spinning. Underneath the money was something else, a thick, leather-bound journal. I picked up the stack of letters. The top one was addressed in that same neat, precise handwriting from the map. It just said, "For Leo." I untied the twine. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a deep brown. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the smell of old paper, dust, and a faint hint of oil. I sat down in the sturdy wooden chair my grandfather had built, pulled it close to the weak fire, and began to read. "My dearest Leo," the first letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are here. And for that, I am both sorry and proud. I am sorry for the life you have had to live. I am sorry I was not there to protect you. And I am proud that you found your way back to the only thing I could truly leave you, a choice." The words blurred. I had to stop and wipe my eyes. The voice in the letters was quiet, sad, but strong. It was the voice I remembered from my childhood, the one that rumbled like a gentle engine. "I imagine you are cold, confused, and angry," the letter continued. "I imagine you look around this place and see a pile of junk, a worthless inheritance. You would be right from a certain point of view. That is what I intended for the world to see. A forgotten man on a forgotten piece of land. It was the only way to keep you safe." I stopped reading for a moment and looked around the grimy, fire-lit room. A fortress, a disguise. The letter explained everything. My grandfather, Thomas, was a master carpenter and cabinet maker, a skill he'd learned from his own father. But after the army, work was scarce. He'd taken a job with a local construction firm that, he soon discovered, was a front for a criminal syndicate run by a powerful local family. They were into land fraud, extortion, racketeering. They used my grandfather's skills to build hidden compartments, secret rooms, and custom furniture to hide their illicit gains. He was trapped. They paid him well, but they owned him. They knew about my mother, his only child, and then they knew about me. He was their golden goose, and we were his golden cage. The money in the box was his share, the dirty money he'd been forced to take over the years. He hadn't spent it. He'd saved every penny, hiding it away, planning. "When your mother passed," he wrote, "and they took you, I knew I had to do something. I could not fight them directly. They would have crushed me, and they would have found a way to get to you, to own you just as they owned me. So I devised a different plan, a long, slow, patient plan. He bought this land, far from anyone, under a false name at first. He built the Quonset hut himself, making it look derelict, worthless. He slowly and legally transferred the ownership to my name, setting it up so it would only become mine on my 18th birthday. He created a ghost, a dead end, a place so unappealing that no one would ever want it, except, apparently, Northwood Developments. "That name," he wrote in a later letter, "is the latest mask they wear. They are not developers. They are scavengers. They believe I hid something of theirs here. Evidence, account books, something to expose them. They are wrong. I destroyed all of that. The only thing I hid here was for you. But they are persistent. They will try to take this land. They will offer you money. It will seem like a lot. Do not take it. My heart was hammering in my chest. It was all real. The shadowy danger, the corporate facade, the feeling that I was being hunted. It wasn't paranoia. It was the truth. I read through the night, feeding the small stove with pieces of scrap wood, the pile of red letters growing on the table beside me. The story that unfolded was one of quiet heroism and heartbreaking sacrifice. He wrote about his love for me, his grief over my mother, his rage at his powerlessness. He filled the leather journal with his woodworking knowledge, schematics, notes on joinery, the properties of different woods. It wasn't just a journal. It was an apprenticeship. "I cannot give you the life you deserved," the final letter concluded, the handwriting a little shakier than the first. "I cannot give you a warm and easy start. The world is not a warm and easy place. But I can give you this, a foundation, a place that is yours, free and clear. The money to be independent of them and everyone else, and the knowledge to build something with your own two hands. What you do with it is your choice, Leo. You can take the money and run, disappear, live a life of quiet anonymity. There is no shame in that. It is a victory in itself. Or you can stay. You can put down roots in this hard ground. You can build. You can fight for this place, for your name, for the future I never had. It is the harder path. It is the more dangerous path. But it is the path to a home. The choice, my boy, is yours. It is the only true thing I have to give you." I put the letter down. The fire in the stove had died down to embers. The first pale gray light of dawn was filtering through the dirty windows, and I was weeping, not just crying, but deep, racking sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the little boy who lost his mother and his grandfather on the same day. I cried for the lonely teenager who grew up believing he was worth nothing more than a number in a state file. I cried for the old man who died alone in a cold metal hut, hoarding money and love for a grandson he couldn't see. I cried until I had nothing left. I cried until the sun was fully up, flooding the Quonset with cold, clear light. And when I was done, when my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw, a strange calm settled over me. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but for the first time it was joined by something else, a fierce, burning resolve. I looked at the money, a mountain of it on the dusty table. I looked at my grandfather's journal, filled with his life's work. I looked at the rough walls of the room he had built. Run or stay. The easy wrong or the harder right. It wasn't a choice at all. My grandfather had given me a foundation. It was my job to build the house. The sun was higher now, a brilliant, cold disk in a painfully blue sky. I was exhausted, emotionally scoured, but my mind was sharp, clear. The path forward was no longer a question mark. It was a set of instructions, left for me by a ghost. First things first. My grandfather's last letter had mentioned a name. "If you choose to stay," he'd written, "you will need help. You cannot fight these people alone. They are snakes, and they own the local courts. But there is one honest man I knew. His name is Gene Avery. He's a lawyer in Cheyenne. He's old, curmudgeonly, and expensive. But he hates this family more than he loves money. He helped me set up the trust for this land. He will know what to do. Tell him you've come to collect on an old debt." I packed a small bag, one bundle of the cash, the deed, and the letter that mentioned Mr. Avery. The rest of the money and the letters I put back in the ammo can, slid it back into its hiding place, and replaced the floorboard. It felt safer there, in the heart of the home. The walk back to the highway felt different this time. The landscape wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. The wind wasn't a threat. It was a challenge. I got to the highway and started walking toward the nearest town, which the map told me was about 10 miles away. I didn't have to wait long. A dusty pickup truck, ancient and beaten, slowed down and pulled over. The driver was the same man who dropped me off from the bus, the one with the magnificent beard. He leaned across the passenger seat and pushed the door open. "Thought that was you," he rumbled. "Figured you'd either be frozen solid or walking out by now. Looks like you're walking out." "I'm just going to town," I said, climbing in. The cab was warm and smelled of coffee and hay. "Need to make a phone call." He gave me a long, sideways look. "Place is still standing, I take it?" "It is," I said. "Good," he grunted, and put the truck in gear. "Your granddad was a good man. Quiet, but good." I stared at him. "You knew him?" "Everyone out here knew Thomas," the driver said, his eyes on the road. "Kept to himself, but if you were in a jam, if your tractor broke down or you needed a hand raising a barn wall, he'd be there. Never took a dime, just a cup of coffee and he'd be on his way. We all knew he had his reasons for being private. We respected it." He drove me into the small town of Basin Creek, which was little more than a main street with a post office, a general store, a bar, and a single, lonely payphone. He dropped me off in front of it. "You need a ride back, you ask for Frank at the store," he said. "Thanks, Frank," I said, meaning it. "Don't mention it," he said, and with a wave, he drove off. I stood in front of the payphone, the receiver cold in my hand. I fed it a pocketful of quarters and dialed the number for Jean Avery, attorney at law. A woman with a crisp, professional voice answered. "Avery and Stern?" "I'd like to speak to Mr. Avery," I said. "It's about an old debt." There was a pause. "Who may I say is calling?" "Leo Mark," I said. "Thomas Mark's grandson." The pause this time was longer. Then, "Please hold." A few minutes later, a gruff voice came on the line. "Avery." "Mr. Avery," I began, my voice suddenly shaky. "My name is Leo Mark. My grandfather, Thomas, he left a letter. He said you could help." There was another silence, but this one was different. It was heavy with thought. "So," the voice said, and it was indeed curmudgeonly. "The boy finally came home. Where are you, son?" "Basin Creek, at a payphone." "Stay right there," he said. "I'll have someone come get you. We have a lot to talk about." An hour later, a sleek black car, completely out of place in the dusty town, pulled up. A young woman in a suit got out. She was maybe a few years older than me, with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Leo Mark?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm Sarah Stern, Mr. Avery's partner. Let's go." The drive to Cheyenne was a blur. I was running on nothing but adrenaline and stale coffee from Frank's store. Sarah didn't ask many questions. She just drove, her silence professional and somehow comforting. Jean Avery's office was in one of the old, stately buildings in downtown Cheyenne. It was filled with dark wood, leather-bound books, and the smell of old paper and justice. Mr. Avery himself was exactly as my grandfather had described him. He was a mountain of a man in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyebrows that looked like two furious caterpillars. He stood up from behind a massive oak desk as I entered. "Leo," he said, his voice softer than it was on the phone. He held out a hand. His grip was firm. "You have your grandfather's eyes." He gestured to a leather chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." I told him. I told him about Northgate, about Ms. Albright, about the bus ride, the Quonset, the cold. I told him about the box, the money, and the letters. I pulled out the one that mentioned his name and handed it to him. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he folded it carefully and handed it back. "Thomas was a good man," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and a stubborn fool. I told him to let me go after those bastards, but he was too afraid of what they'd do to you. So he built you a fortress instead." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Northwood Developments has been trying to buy that land for 6 months. They started with lowball offers to the state, and the day you turned 18, they sent a formal offer to your caseworker. They want that property, Leo. They think Thomas hid his account books there, the ones detailing all their dirty dealings for 20 years. They don't know he burned them. They think they're recovering an asset. What they're really doing is trying to erase the last loose end of a very long, very ugly story." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. A slow, grim smile spread across Jean Avery's face. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who has been waiting patiently for a very long time. "What do we do?" he repeated. "First, you're going to sign this." He slid a document across the desk. "It retains me as your legal counsel. Then, we are going to send Northwood Developments a letter. A very polite, very firm letter telling them to go to hell. Then, we're going to file an injunction for harassment. And then, just for fun, we're going to open up a new inquiry into the unsolved disappearance of a building inspector who crossed them 15 years ago, citing new information from a confidential informant. We're not going to fight them on their terms, son. We're going to drag them into the light and watch them burn." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Mr. Avery was true to his word. He was a force of nature. His partner, Sarah Stern, was the quiet, methodical architect of the legal assault. While he made the thunderous phone calls, she drafted the precise, inescapable documents. My first act as a client was to deposit 9 of the 10 bundles of cash into a trust account that Mr. Avery set up. It was a staggering amount of money, but he was clear. "This isn't lottery winnings, Leo. This is a war chest. We'll use it to protect your grandfather's legacy." I kept 1 bundle with me. It was still more money than I knew what to do with. I moved out of the Quonset temporarily into a small, clean motel room in Cheyenne that Mr. Avery arranged. He insisted I be closer, safer. The first letter from our side went out. As promised, it was a masterpiece of legal aggression disguised as polite refusal. The response from Northwood was swift. A letter from their high-priced law firm arrived, full of veiled threats about eminent domain, tax liens, and public nuisance claims. They were escalating. "Good," Mr. Avery had said, rubbing his hands together. "They're taking the bait." While the lawyers fought their paper war, I had my own battles. I was restless in the motel. I felt disconnected, useless. The purpose I'd found in the Quonset felt distant. I spent my days in the Cheyenne Public Library, reading. I read about property law, about water rights, and about sustainable building. And at night, I studied my grandfather's journal. His drawings were clean, his notes meticulous. He wasn't just a carpenter, he was an artist. He wrote about the grain of the wood as if it were a living thing, about the integrity of a well-made joint. It was a language of love, patience, and respect for his craft. I bought books on woodworking, starting with the basics. I bought a new sketchbook and pencils and started copying his designs, first awkwardly, then with growing confidence. I wasn't just learning a skill, I was learning his language. I was getting to know the man who had given everything for me. After 2 weeks, I couldn't stand the city anymore. "I have to go back," I told Mr. Avery. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "It's not entirely safe, Leo." "It's my home," I said, and for the first time, the word didn't feel strange on my tongue. "It's the only one I have." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you won't be alone." The next day, Frank, the man with the beard and the pickup truck, showed up at my motel. "Gene called me," he said you needed a ride, and a neighbor." He drove me back to the Quonset. It looked just as I'd left it, cold and quiet. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I had a plan. The first thing I did was buy a truck, a used but sturdy Ford, from a lot in Cheyenne. Then, I started buying supplies. Not just food and blankets, but tools. A good hammer, a set of chisels, a handsaw. I used my grandfather's money, but every purchase felt like an investment, not an expense. The work was slow and hard. I started by cleaning. I shoveled out years of accumulated dirt and debris. I scrubbed the concrete floor. I repaired the broken windows. Frank would stop by every other day, sometimes with a hot thermos of coffee, sometimes with a box of donuts. He never said much, but his presence was a comfort. He brought other people by, too. A woman named Maria, who ran the general store, who brought me a box of fresh vegetables from her garden. An old man named Hank, who was a retired electrician and offered to help me figure out how to run a generator. They were my grandfather's friends. They were the community he had quietly built. And now they were becoming mine. Northwood didn't stay quiet for long. One morning, a man in a suit showed up in a shiny black SUV. He was slick and smooth, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mark," he said, extending a hand I didn't take. "I'm from Northwood Developments. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're prepared to make you a new offer, a much more significant one." "The property is not for sale," I said, my voice steady. I was holding a shovel, and the weight of it in my hands gave me courage. His smile faltered. "Don't be foolish, kid. This is a unique, one-time opportunity. Take the money, go to college, see the world. Don't chain yourself to this relic." "I like it here," I said. "It's quiet." His eyes narrowed. "We can make things very unquiet for you." "Is that a threat?" I asked. "It's advice," he said, turning to leave. "Take it." That night, I called Mr. Avery and told him about the visit. "That's harassment," he said, his voice grim. "We can use that. Keep a log of everything, Leo. Every car that drives by, every strange phone call, everything." The fight was far from over, but as I stood in the doorway of my Quonset, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, I didn't feel fear. I felt a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a boy who had been given a strange inheritance. I was a guardian. I was a builder. I was home. The seasons turned. The harsh Wyoming winter descended, burying the land in a thick blanket of white. The wind howled, and the temperature dropped to unimaginable lows. But inside the Quonset, there was warmth. The little wood stove, my grandfather's stove, became the heart of my home. I'd installed a generator, thanks to Hank's guidance, so I had light to work by in the long, dark evenings. I'd insulated the walls of the small living area, just as the journal instructed. It was a small bubble of civilization in a vast, wild world. Winter was a time for internal work, both on the hut and on myself. With the land frozen, I turned my attention inward, to the craft my grandfather had left me. I set up a workshop in a corner of the main bay. I started with the simplest project in his journal, a small, three-legged stool. My first attempt was a disaster. The legs were uneven, the joints loose. It wobbled pathetically. I threw it on the fire in frustration, but I tried again and again. I learned to read the grain of the wood, to feel the way the chisel cut, to respect the tools. Slowly, my hands started to understand what my mind was learning. By the time the first thaw came, I had built a sturdy workbench, a set of shelves, and a chair that was a near-perfect replica of the one my grandfather had left behind. They were simple things, but they were solid, they were honest, and they were mine. With the spring came a new offensive from Northwood. Their lawyers filed a motion to have the property condemned as a public nuisance. It was a baseless, desperate move, but it meant more time, more money, more trips to Cheyenne for depositions. Mr. Avery and Sarah met it with a ferocious countersuit, but the process was draining. There were days when the weight of it all felt like too much. Days when I looked at the money still sitting in the trust and thought about how easy it would be to just walk away. But then I would look at the chair I had built, or feel the solid heft of the workbench under my hands, and the feeling would pass. I was building something more than furniture. I was building a life. The community around me solidified. Frank, Maria, and Hank became my unofficial council of elders. They'd show up with casseroles and advice. They told me stories about my grandfather, filling in the gaps in his letters. They told me about his quiet acts of kindness, his dry sense of humor, his deep love for the stark, beautiful land we all called home. Through their stories, he became more than a tragic hero. He became a man. One day, Sarah Stern drove out from Cheyenne. She brought a box of files with her. "We found something," she said, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. It was a breakthrough. Digging through old county archives, she had uncovered a pattern of land purchases by Northwood and its previous shell companies. They would buy up surrounding parcels, isolate a property, then use legal and financial pressure to force the owner to sell for a fraction of its worth. But you'd also found a case from 20 years ago where they'd been sloppy. They'd been sued by a rancher who fought back, and in the discovery process, a name had been mentioned in a deposition. The name of the man from the suit who had visited me. "His name is Fletcher," Sarah said, "and he's not just some corporate stooge. His family is one of the ones my grandfather wrote about. He's one of them." "We've got them," I said, a surge of adrenaline shooting through me. "Not yet," she cautioned, "but we're closer. This connects the present company to the past criminal enterprise. It's the link we needed." That summer, I cleared the land around the Quonset. I planted a small garden with seeds Maria gave me. I watched the green shoots push their way up through the hard-packed earth and felt a sense of wonder. I was creating life. I was putting down roots, literally and figuratively. I realized that my inheritance wasn't the money in the box, or even the land itself. It was the resilience my grandfather had modeled. It was the choice to face hardship and build something good in its place. Home isn't a place you find, it's a place you make. It's the slow, patient work of laying one stone, one plank, one seed at a time. It's the community you build around you, the people who show up with coffee and casseroles when the wind is howling. It's the legacy you choose to honor. I was no longer the boy who left Northgate with nothing. I was Thomas Mark's grandson. I was a builder, and I was finally, truly, home. The legal battle dragged on for another year, a slow war of attrition fought with paper and ink. But with the connection Sarah had found, the tide had turned. Northwood's lawyers became less aggressive, more conciliatory. They offered a settlement, a large one. Mr. Avery presented it to me in his office. "They're offering to drop all claims and pay you a substantial sum for the harassment," he said, sliding the paper across his desk. It was a number with a lot of zeros, a life-changing amount of money. "What do they want in return?" I asked. "A non-disclosure agreement. We walk away, and we never speak of their connection to the old criminal syndicate again. They get to continue operating under their new, clean name." I looked at Mr. Avery. He was watching me, his expression neutral. He was leaving this choice to me, just as my grandfather had. I thought about the money. I thought about how it could smooth over every rough edge of my life. And then I thought about Frank and Maria and Hank. I thought about the other families in the county who had been pushed off their land by these same people. I thought about my grandfather, who had spent his life in their shadow. "No," I said. "Tell them no." A slow smile spread across Jean Avery's face. The real one this time. "I was hoping you'd say that." We didn't settle. We went to court. It wasn't a big, dramatic trial. It was a series of hearings, motions, and testimonies. But we presented our case, brick by brick. We showed the pattern of harassment, the historical ties. We didn't win a huge movie-style victory. The system is too complex for that. But we won. The judge issued a permanent injunction against Northwood and all its affiliates, barring them from contacting me or attempting to purchase my land ever again. And he referred the case to the state's attorney general for an investigation into their business practices. It was a quiet victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The day the ruling came down, I was at the Quonset, sanding the top of a large dining table I was building from reclaimed lumber. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "We won." I put down my tools, walked outside, and just stood there, breathing the clean, cold air. The wind was blowing, but for the first time, it didn't feel like it was trying to push me over. It felt like it was welcoming me home. That evening, my neighbors showed up. Frank, Maria, Hank, and a dozen others I'd gotten to know. They brought covered dishes, bottles of wine, and a guitar. We pushed the table I'd just finished into the center of the main bay of the Quonset, and we filled it with food. We ate and we talked, and someone played music. The vast, empty space that had once felt so cold and intimidating was filled with light, laughter, and warmth. It was no longer a tomb or a fortress. It was a home, and it was full. My story, I've come to realize, isn't really about a rusted Quonset hut or a box of money. It's not about legal battles or corporate villains. It's about what we inherit. We all inherit something. For some, it's money or property. For others, it's a name, a tradition, a set of values. For me, it was a choice. My grandfather didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a foundation and a set of instructions for how to build a life. He left me the harder path and the strength to walk it. And in doing so, he gave me a gift far more valuable than money. A sense of self, a community, and a place to belong. He taught me that home isn't something you're given. It's something you build with your own two hands, out of the raw materials of your life, no matter how humble they may be. And that is a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my days. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening. My journey started from a place of feeling completely alone, with nothing to my name but a mystery. And what I want to leave you with is this. Sometimes the things that look like burdens are actually foundations in disguise. Sometimes the most dilapidated, forgotten places hold the most profound treasures. It's about having the courage to look closer, to push on the loose board, to read the letters that have been left for you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to build a life from the ground up, or if you're in the middle of that process right now, I want you to know you're not alone. This channel is for us. It's a community for people who understand that the most important things in life aren't given, they're built. So please, hit that subscribe button, join our community, and in the comments below, I want you to tell me, what have you built? It doesn't have to be a house. It can be a career, a family, a friendship, a new skill, a newfound sense of peace. Tell me about the foundations you've laid. I'll be reading every single comment, because every story of building, of creating something good in a hard world, is a victory, and it deserves to be told. Thank you.